Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. I have a weird experience that I wanted to share that was just, well, I honestly don't know what words to use to describe it. It was creepy in its own right, and honestly, it left me feeling a bit shaken. Thankfully, I came out of the whole thing unscathed, but I kind of feel like it could have gone much, much worse. So, to start off, I'm a delivery driver for a restaurant that isn't the normal kind that does delivery. I'm the only driver for this specific restaurant, and while we aren't as busy as, say, pizza shops, we do get enough orders to keep me busy for the entire shift. Because of this, I put a good number of miles on my car, and I drain my tank pretty frequently. Sometimes, I have to stop at random stations along the way or in between deliveries to make sure that I have enough miles left to get to the next stop or stops, and then back home to base. It takes a good amount of coordination, and I have honestly pushed it once or twice to a limit that I don't like to push it to. This was, unfortunately, one of those times. It was near closing time, and I was on the last 3 deliveries. It was a triple, so I had to take one, then the next, and then the next as quickly as I could. I had gotten the first one done. I looked up the location for the next, and as soon as I did, I noticed that the mile counter on my car showed 3. Basically, I had 3 miles to go until it was on a hard E. I wouldn't say that this was the most accurate reading, but again, I don't want to end up randomly stranded with 2 people's dinner sitting in my passenger seat. So, I hit the button for the nearest gas station, and sure enough, there was one that was between 1 mile and 2 miles from where I was sitting. It looked like it was kind of tucked in between a couple of neighborhoods, like this was a really weird place station, but I was just thankful that it was close. I then pulled away and made the quick trip to the station. And sure enough, it was there. Google was not lying to me at all. The building was dark, like they had closed up for the night, but the pumps had card readers and were definitely still on based on the lights that were shining on the screens and overhead. I pulled into the parking lot and then got up to one of the pumps. I got out, swiped my card, basically did all the things that one does when they are filling their tank. After a couple seconds, I noticed a couple guys standing next to the building. One of them was sitting on the ground and smoking, and I could see the embers glowing in the dark, and the other was staring at me from under his hood. Of course, I was a bit on edge. I had cash on me from the deliveries, but at the same time, with where he was standing, I would have had time to throw the pump and jump into my car before he could even get close. So, assuming that he didn't have a gun or anything, I was cautious, but pretty sure that I was safe. I go back to filling up, and as the amount hits 5 gallons, the pump just suddenly stops. I stare at it, squeeze it once or twice, but sure enough, it was done with me. I looked up at the machine, then toward the building, as if there was going to be someone there to help me, when I noticed that the man with the cigarette in his mouth was now standing at the emergency shutoff valve, which explained why the pump stopped working. Within the second that it took me to realize that it was just him, I heard footsteps behind me and I thought, I really just let this happen after telling myself that I was going to be fine and that I would have time to jump in my car. I'm seriously about to get robbed by this creep. I turned slightly, and as expected, The man with the hoodie on is approaching me. But strangely enough, he's not getting too close. Like he was walking toward me, but stopped about 6 or so feet from me. He lifts his head a bit to stare at me, and I look at him. And there were several very awkward moments that we shared standing at this gas station pump. The whole time I was just thinking, I'm dead. I'm absolutely dead. This is how I'm gonna die. While glancing between him and the man at the shut-off button on the building, making sure that neither of them is getting closer or pulling a gun or something. I have no idea why I did this, but I looked at the man in the hoodie and just kind of shyly said, the pump isn't working. Like this man worked here, I was going to go troubleshoot the problem. I really don't know why I said this. I guess it was just me being scared and confused as to what was about to happen. The man smirks, looks down at me, then up to the machine and says, "Station's closed." As if I wasn't already being awkward and weird, I pointed toward the card reader and said something like, "Oh, but I should be able to still get gas. The readers are 24/7. This guy in the hoodie seriously started laughing like I had just told him the most hilarious joke and he could not hold it in. After shaking that off, he shook his head and looked back at me and said, "No, mate, the station is closed. No more gas." And then motioned for me to get in my car to leave. I stood there for a moment, and thankfully, my brain finally clicked that he was telling me to get the hell out of there. I nodded, replaced the pump, and then told him to have a good evening and got back in my car. And as I did, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I watched this guy put his finger up to his head and motion as if he was shooting himself, and then start laughing again as he waved at me. I obviously took off from there, and it took a few moments for me to really get a grip on the whole thing. But I think he was basically telling me that if I came back, I was dead. I made a note of where I was and well, I left. Now, I'm not sure, but I think that his original plan was much more sinister than what he ended up doing. And I think my awkwardness may have saved me. Like, I made my comment, and it tickled him to the point that he felt bad, and he just thought, I can't kill this pitiful idiot. Obviously, I have no idea if that's true, or if he was just willing to give me the opportunity to leave, and if I didn't, then he would take action. But I'm glad that he decided that I wasn't worth his time. Thankfully, that 5 gallons was more than enough to get me to my destinations and then get me back to the store to clock out. I made a note to never go back to that station, and I haven't, thankfully. If I have a delivery over in that direction, I fill up before I go that way just in case. I know it's not the creepiest of stories, but it definitely scared me. And like I said, I came out unscathed. But I feel like I was pretty close to something pretty terrible happening. Growing up in a small town has a certain charm and simplicity that can make a childhood feel like it exists in its own bubble. My town was one of those places that didn't have much, mostly farmland stretching out as far as the eye could see, a single school that catered to all the kids in the area, and a few family-owned shops. There wasn't much to do, but that simplicity was part of its appeal. We knew everyone, and everyone knew us, which made the idea of danger seem almost foreign. Out of all the places we could go, my favorite was the gas station that had a shop attached to it. It was probably the biggest shop in town, and the person who worked there as the clerk was a family friend. His presence always made me feel safe, like an extra layer of protection. My parents were comfortable enough to let me go there by myself, or sometimes with my little sister tagging along. Let's call her Emmy. The shop was only a 15-minute walk away from our house, a manageable distance that didn't stir up concerns. The gas station was a place people generally thought of as safe. Given that it was the social hub of our little town, it was rare to find a face that you didn't recognize. That sense of familiarity bred a kind of communal trust, an unspoken assurance that we were all looking out for each other. One scorching summer afternoon stands out in my memory though. I was 12 and Emmy was 7. I had just finished the chore that my mom had assigned to me, and as a reward, she handed me some cash. The sun was relentless that day, and the idea of getting an ice cream cone was too tempting to resist. I asked my mom for permission to go to the shop, and she agreed on the condition that I take Emmy along. She even gave me a couple of extra bucks for Emmy's ice cream. So, my sister and I set off down the familiar path without a worry in our minds. The sun was still high, bathing everything in a golden light. As we walked, we chatted about the mundane things the way that siblings do. The walk felt short, and soon enough, we reached the gas station. It was quieter than usual, but that wasn't entirely surprising given the time of day. However, something caught our eye. A red, shiny pickup truck parked near the gas pump. It looked brand new, like it had just been bought that day. This was unusual because most of the trucks and cars in our town were old and worn out. The newness of the truck made it stand out like a sore thumb. Our attention then shifted to the man pumping gas into the truck. He was a stranger, and in the town where everyone knew everyone, an unfamiliar face was immediately noticeable. He looked like he was in his late 20s, wearing a jean jacket, loose jeans, and a hat. And when he saw us, he took off his hat, revealing his unkempt oily hair, and then he gave us a smile that made my skin crawl. He waved hello, but there was something off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to ignore him, but Emily, being young and innocent, waved back. Well, that was all it took for the man to start talking to us. His initial questions were innocent though, how we liked the weather, what snacks we were planning to buy. His chatter didn't raise any immediate red flags, but there was just something sinister about him that set my instincts on edge, and I just could not figure out what it was. As the conversation progressed, he mentioned that he was new to the town and that he would love it if we showed him around. I declined his offer immediately, but he persisted. He said that he would buy us snacks if we promised that we would get into his truck and then show him the best places in town. I told him that there was nothing to see and that our parents were waiting for us to come back soon. He then offered to just drive us home after we were done buying snacks. There was something in the desperation in his voice that made my heart race. I kept glancing into the shop, hoping to see our family friend, the clerk, but he was nowhere to be seen, and I just feel the panic began to set in. Emily was still blissfully unaware of the danger and then continued to engage with the man. But my heart nearly stopped when I heard her scream. When I turned, I saw the man had grabbed her by her wrist and was trying to pull her toward the truck. Pure adrenaline surged through me. I ran to Emmy, grabbed her other hand, and started pulling her back while hitting the man and screaming for help. His grip on her wrist was tightening, and it was hurting my little sister, and she started crying. It felt like an eternity, but I held on with all my strength, driven by sheer terror and probably the adrenaline. And then, I heard the door of the shop burst open. Our family friend came running out and punched the man in the face. The man let go of Emmy because of this, and I pulled her into the shop as fast as I could. Everything after that is a blur in my memory. I vaguely remember my mom arriving and the sheriff showing up shortly after. We went to the clinic too to get Emmy's wrist checked out. Long story short, our family friend was in the toilet doing his business when I couldn't see him. When he heard the screams, he came out as fast as he could. Then, he and the man exchanged some blows. Unfortunately, the creep managed to jump into his truck and then speed off while he was regaining his balance after getting a blow. He called the sheriff and then my mom, and she then arrived in minutes and stayed with us as we waited for the police. That day changed everything. From then on, my mom insisted on accompanying us whenever we wanted to go to the shop. We never saw that man again, thank goodness. I'm in my 30s now with a child of my own, and I've made sure to teach them about stranger danger. That experience left a mark on me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, even in a place that you consider safe. So, to the man in the red pickup truck who tried to get me and my sister into his truck, let's never meet again, ever. I was on a long drive trip a while back, heading to another state for a work event that I was pretty much told that I needed to be a part of. I was given the options to fly or to drive a rental car out there, and if I drove, I had to do it on a weekend and I wouldn't be paid for the mileage, which, whatever. I am terrified of flying, so I chose driving. There's no particular reason for me to be terrified of flying, but the 2 times that I've been on a plane, I have had the full-blown panic attacks that have ended in me vomiting. I think it's just me. I just get freaked out and I panic. So, obviously, I told my boss that I would get a rental and I would drive to the conference. The trip took way longer than I honestly anticipated, and I was driving pretty late into the night, and at the point where this event happened, I was running low on gas. I wasn't low enough that I would have ended up on the side of the highway, at least I don't think so, but I was low enough that I made plans to fill up at the next station that I saw on the exit sign. I went for a while longer so that there was a station at the next exit that indicated that it was open 24 hours, and I thought that I should consider stopping to use the restroom, get something to drink, and then fill up my tank. I pulled off, and after a bit of searching, I found the station. It was decently lit, so that wasn't a huge deal for me. But as I parked, I noticed that in the same parking lot as the station was what looked like an old motel that was boarded up. It kind of looked like a stereotypical old motel, 2 floors, 3 rooms on each floor, and then 1 extra room at the bottom that had the word office on it. A couple of the rooms were missing their doors, and some of them were just boarded up. Some of the windows looked smashed even. Honestly, it was a bit unsettling, but I wasn't here for the lodging. I was there for gas. I headed into the station, and it looked decent at the very least. Like, it was a bit dim, and a couple of the fluorescent bulbs were burned out, but the floor was clean and everything was well stocked. It wasn't a small station either. There was actually a good amount of space, and everything looked open, so it was kept up. There were 2 guys standing at the front counter talking to the clerk, and honestly, none of them looked too threatening. They just looked pretty normal. As I walked in, the clerk turned his attention to me, and he, very politely, asked me if he could help me find anything. I asked if he had a restroom, and then he motioned toward the back. I nodded, and then I headed back, and I did my business. As I was washing my hands though, I heard what sounded like all three men giggling like school children. At what, I don't know. But at the same time, people laughing isn't necessarily a bad thing or creepy. It was just something that I noted. When I walked out of the restroom, I could literally feel the three of them just staring at me as I went over to the cooler to get something to drink for the rest of the trip and also grabbed a snack. I thought that they would look away or break their stares as I walked toward the counter. But no, they all three just kept watching me as I approached. I tried my best to ignore it as the guys scanned my items. But after a few moments of my skin starting to crawl as the other two were glaring, I looked over toward them with a look like, "All right, I know you're staring. You can stop now." As soon as my attention was turned toward them, one of the guys took this opportunity to say, "We were making a bet on something, and we wanted to know, what would you rate me out of a 10? This caught me a bit off guard, and I wasn't really sure what to say. I just kind of scoffed and turned back toward the clerk. Unfortunately, he was in on their game, and he was just staring at me with his eyes wide, holding my Red Bull. At this point, I was just so annoyed, so I just said that I would like to pay for my stuff and go. And he told me that he would give me my things when I answered the question. I said that I wasn't interested in whatever this was, and that I would just like to pay and go. And once again, he laughed and said, No, not until you answer him." At this point, I decided that it wasn't worth my time to put up with this, and there were three of them versus one of me. I turned and I walked away from them. But as soon as I reached the door, I felt a hand reach out and grab my hip. Unfortunately for the person that grabbed me, which was the man that had asked me to rate him, as I was walking toward the door, I had actually unhooked my pepper spray from my keys, and I had a small cartridge that had a keyring on it, and he took the full blast of it to his face. The other two started yelling at me, he started screaming, and I turned and took off toward my car. Thankfully, the car had a push start, so I was able to get the engine going and get out on the road before the three of them could even get out into the parking lot. The whole time that I was pulling away and getting back onto the highway, I was looking back at my rear view, seeing that they weren't following me, which thankfully they weren't. After about 5 minutes of being back on the highway, I just pulled over and resituated myself, trying to calm down and get through the anxiety attack that was definitely hitting me. In the end, I was thankful that I had the mental wherewithal to grab my pepper spray while I was walking. I just had that feeling that one of them was going to try something. I ended up going for another half hour until I found a gas station in a much less creepy and much more populated area, and then I filled up without an issue. This was definitely the event that made it click that these things can happen to me, and that I am way more aware of my surroundings now. Before they started in on being a creep, I really didn't get any red flags. But even those that don't seem like creeps can be the worst. I'm not saying be paranoid and be scared of everyone, just that being prepared is always a good idea. I work the overnight shift at a gas station that is situated in a suburban area that isn't fully incorporated. And by that, I mean that there aren't houses everywhere, and there are quite a few spots that are dense forest. When you live and work near areas that are just trees like this, a lot of weird rumors and stories get thrown around, and this was no exception. I'd actually heard some dumb stories about the woods from coworkers. There was a rumor that they, whoever they were, had found a bunch of mutilated deer out there, and that a man had once been camping in the woods and got attacked by something. I don't know why a man would be camping in the woods behind a neighborhood, but it is what it is. They were just silly stories told by people to scare others. Of course, now I'm a bit more of a believer because of the fact that I saw something in those woods that I can't really explain. It was a pretty quiet night. We weren't very busy, so I was taking the opportunity to do some restocking and cleaning of some of the shelves that we had. As I was stocking some of the chips, I heard what sounded like a thud coming from where the dumpster was on the side of the building. Unfortunately, we'd had issues with a homeless guy that kept trying to sleep in our dumpster, and as much as I felt bad for the guy, I couldn't let him do that because the truck came for the dumpster at like 4 in the morning, so if he was sleeping in it overnight, bad things could happen. I stepped outside to check it out, see if it was him again, and if it was, to tell him that he couldn't stay there. As soon as I stepped outside, I got hit with something I actually struggled to describe beyond a hit of adrenaline that sent chills down my spine. It was like I needed to be scared of something, and my body knew that I needed to be scared, but I didn't know what I needed to be scared of. I slowly turned toward where the dumpster was, and I really don't know what it was that I was looking at, but whatever it was, it had dropped the dumpster on its side and was tearing into the trash. I just sort of stood there staring at this nasty mass of fur that was eating the garbage. I think I was trying to place a name to this thing that I was seeing. Like, was it some kind of a dog, a wolf, or a coyote? But no, I can say with certainty that this thing was canine-like, but it was not a normal canine. Its body was lanky, like its limbs were extended like a person's, and it was way too large to be any sort of dog. It was like anything that I have ever seen before. If I had to put a number to it, I would say that it could have easily stood 6 foot tall. Its fur was matted and dirty and dark, and I could see that this thing had hellish claws on its hands or paws or whatever. After a few minutes of me just standing there and watching this thing, it noticed me and kind of just sniffed in my direction, but it ended up turning away and crawling back into the trees. I watched it as it went back into the forest and just kind of stood there watching me as I watched it. Though it was probably just waiting for me to leave, and I was watching it because I was horrified. When I regained control of my legs, I ran back into the station and just stayed at the counter, pretending that this whole event never even happened, because I didn't want to think about the possibility of that thing being out there, lurking. I tried to rationalize what I saw numerous times, saying that it was a wolf, or maybe a really skinny bear, but I know for a fact that it was not. I don't know what it was, but I don't have a name for it other than creepy dog-looking cryptid thing. I'm sure that someone else will probably say what they think it was, and I welcome that because any information would help me. I haven't seen it since that night, and I still work the same shift, but it hasn't come back, thankfully. Though, I will say now, every time that I hear something out the back of the store messing with a dumpster, I tend to ignore it. I've worked at a small gas station in the middle of nowhere kind of town for quite a few years now. I used to work the day shift, but I decided that I would take the pay increase and lose my social life and work the overnight shift instead. Not like I had much of a social life to lose, to be honest. I've been married for about 10 years, And we don't exactly go out to parties or hang out with our friends or anything. Thankfully, my wife doesn't mind that I work the overnight shift, and we've made it work between the two of us. Honestly, the job has been incredibly uneventful for the years that I've worked it, with very little exception. Obviously, this is an event that is an exception. One important thing to note about this station is that we are mostly a 24/7 station, with a 1 hour exception each night for us to count down the drawer and do the receipt drop in the back. Basically, we close for 1 hour to mark the end of the day for the business and to pull the numbers. They used to not close to do it, but there was one point where the store was actually robbed by a former employee during the count because he knew the time that it was done, and the door was unlocked, so he took advantage of it. Ever since then, they've made it to where the store is closed for 1 hour every single night. It's a weird system, but it works in the end. On this night, I had closed down the store at 3 a.m. as I was scheduled to do, and I had counted down the drawer first, then did the receipt print for the cards. I had actually gotten it down in about 40 minutes, so I had 20 minutes until I needed to reopen, and I decided that I would go ahead and just take a few moments to myself behind the counter, kind of like a power nap kind of thing. Not really sleeping, but just doze off for the 20 minutes. A couple minutes after that I had sat and closed my eyes, I started hearing what sounded like a banging noise. It was enough to pull me out of my light nap and make me jump. I looked around at the door, and there was a woman that was smacking the door and pulling on it as hard as she could. At first, I instinctively started saying, "Oh, sorry, we're closed until 4. I can't unlock the door until then." But as I started talking, I could tell by the way she was frantically pulling at the door and staring at me that something was seriously wrong. Since I'd already counted down the drawer, I figured that I could let her in and at least see what the hell was going on. I walked around the counter and then unlocked the door and asked what I could help her with. She told me that her car had broken down a few blocks down the road, and that she was trying to get here so that she could have someone pick her up since she wasn't from around here. But she then said that for the last block or two, there was someone that was following her. Now, this was definitely a creepy story, but I was a bit skeptical at first. It almost felt like one of those stories that you would tell to scam someone or to get them to let their guard down. I actually asked her what she wanted me to do, and she said that she just wanted to come inside and call her husband so he could come get her. After a few moments of her reiterating things and me feeling like she was likely telling the truth, I decided to just let her in and lock the door. I told her that we weren't technically open, so I couldn't have her anywhere in the store other than the front. She said she understood and that she would stay at the front door and apologize for the whole thing, saying that she didn't mean to be a bother. She was just really scared about what the guy that was following her was planning on doing. At this point, I felt like she was leaning too heavy into the story to be lying to me, so I told her that it wasn't a bother and mentioned that if she sees him, I'll go ahead and call the cops for her. After a few minutes of her talking on her phone to who I am assuming was her husband, and then her waiting and just staring out the front door, she started making a bit of small talk, which was fine to me. I still had a couple of minutes before I could reopen, so I kind of welcomed the conversation. No sooner than we started just talking about whatever, I heard another loud sound, but this time, it wasn't just a person smacking the glass. It was the sound of something smashing the glass on the side door. Thankfully, the door was designed so that smashing it wouldn't allow access as the glass was reinforced, wasn't very wide and there were four metal bars across it. But this guy was seriously doing everything he could to smash the glass so that he could get in. Like, he was pretty clear in what he was trying to do. The woman screamed, and I kind of yelped like, "What the hell?" And I turned to look at the scene in front of me. And after realizing what was happening, it occurred to me to hit the panic button. I know you're not supposed to hit them until the robber leaves in order to prevent a hostage situation, but I knew that he wasn't going to be able to get into the store with what he was doing. I'm sure this whole thing played out in like 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Just standing there, watching this guy rapidly smashing the glass in the door and trying his hardest to get into the station. All the while, this woman is screaming that this is the guy that was following her. I'm telling her to get behind the counter and trying to figure out what the hell to do. I guess that the guy realized that he wasn't going to get it, and he just kind of stood there staring at the two of us with this horrible grin. Like, you could see the malice just pouring out of this guy, and he kept pointing at the two of us and shaking his head. It was terrifying. At no point did he say a word. He just stared, smiled, pointed, and shook his head back and forth, which felt more threatening than if he had been screaming at us. And then finally, I heard the sirens as the officers started to pull into the lot, and this guy took off behind the building and out of sight. A couple of the officers took after him, and another one came to the door to check on us. I went over and opened it, and, well, that was a fun time, explaining to him and the owner when he showed up what the hell had gone on. The woman explained her side, I told them my side, and it was pretty much the same, honestly. She had no idea who this guy was, and I obviously didn't know him too. This was just some dude that was an absolute psycho and had ill intentions with this poor woman. The officers waited for her husband to show up to come get her, and I ended up having a long night with them and the owner going over everything. We were going through the footage on the cameras. The owner wasn't too happy that I let her in during our closed hour, but I straight told him that if I hadn't, this guy would have gotten to her, and that would have been worse than a bit of property damage. Thankfully, this was the most eventful situation that I've had on this job, and I hope that it stays that way. I don't know if they ended up catching the guy or if he got away from that night, but I never saw him after that, nor did I ever see her too. I was definitely a bit nervous to go back to work the next day, but it was just normal operations after that. I did have to explain to a few of our regulars what happened to the door, which got old, but it is what it is. So, to that lady, I do hope that you're doing okay and this didn't traumatize you too much. And to that guy, I hope you and I never meet again, you absolute psycho. My name is Lily, and I'm a college student working part-time at a gas station to make ends meet. I've always struggled with insomnia, and instead of spending my nights tossing and turning, I decided that it would be better to work the overnight shift. It seemed like a practical solution, allowing me to earn some money while keeping my mind occupied. The gas station is a small 24-hour joint located on the outskirts of town. Most nights are quiet, with only the occasional customer stopping by to either fuel up or grab a snack. I usually spend my time behind the counter, flipping through my textbooks or browsing the internet when the store is empty. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of the refrigerators have become the soundtrack to my nights. One night, at around 1 a.m., I was behind the counter trying to focus on my reading. The station was empty, and the silence was almost comforting. The door chime rang and I looked up to see a man walk in. He was wearing a large, dirty green coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His hair was unkempt, and he had a fidgety demeanor, constantly shifting his weight from one foot to another. As part of my job, I greeted him with a polite, "Good evening, sir." But instead of replying, he just stared at me. His eyes lingered on mine for a little too long, and it made me feel uneasy. But I just tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was probably just as tired or distracted. And without saying a word, he turned and started walking through the aisles, his eyes scanning the shelves. I watched as he picked up a few bags of chips, examined them, and then put them back. But after a few minutes, he finally came up to the counter and then placed several bags of chips in front of me. He smiled, but there was something off about it. His lips curled up, but his eyes remained cold and weird. He then asked me about the cigarettes, which were stored behind the counter for safety reasons. I nodded, and I turned around to get them. As I reached for the pack, I heard the crinkling sound of a chip bag being opened. I turned back quickly to see that he had opened one of the bags and was eating the chips. I said, "Sir, you need to pay for those before you eat them." I was trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled, a creepy, unsettling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, okay," he said, putting the half-eaten bag back on the counter. I handed him the pack of cigarettes and I asked for his ID. He reached into his jacket to get his wallet, but as he did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tucked into his pants was a gun. My heart started racing, and I felt a surge of fear and panic. He saw me staring and then asked, "What, see something you like?" Before giving me a wink, I was both disgusted and terrified. I was trying to keep my composure, and I checked his ID, my hands trembling slightly. He went to pay for the items, but he was a bit short on cash. His expression darkened, and he looked very upset. He then asked if I could cover for him. I initially started to refuse him. I said, "I don't think that..." And then I was cut off by the man slamming his fist against the counter. He had a stone-cold look in his eyes, and I jumped, startled by the sudden act of violence. At that point, I just decided to go along with it. The fear of what he might do next was overwhelming me, and I said, "Okay, just pay what you have and I'll cover the rest." My voice barely audible. He smiled, a sinister glint in his eyes, and said, "Well, that's a good girl." He then took the items and left, giving me one last wink before walking out the door. I stood there, shaken and disgusted. My mind was racing. I couldn't believe what just happened. The man's presence had been unsettling from the moment he walked in, but seeing the gun and the way he had interacted with me left me feeling vulnerable and scared. I hoped to never see him again. The rest of my shift was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts consumed by the encounter that just happened. Every time that the door chime rang, my heart would skip a beat, fearing that he had come back and probably take more things. Or maybe finally shoot me, I don't know. But finally, when my shift ended, I clocked out as quickly as I could, and then I headed home, still shaken by the experience. Over the next few nights, I became increasingly paranoid. Every time a new customer walked in, I would tense up, my mind flashing back to the man in a dirty green coat. I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that he had left behind. I reported the incident to my manager, who assured me that they would increase security. I don't really know what they meant by that. It's not like we had a security guard or something, and we never hired one. and they also said that they would keep an eye out for the man. But the fear never truly went away. I just tried to focus on my job and my studies, but it was always on the back of my mind. Months passed and I never saw the man again, thankfully. The gas station remained quiet, other than a few other awkward encounters, but not as dangerous as that one. To this day, I don't know what happened to the man in the dirty green coat, but the memory of that night, the fear, the vulnerability, the thoughts of what would have happened if I didn't go along with what he said, or if he asked for something else, will haunt my mind forever. So, to the man in the dirty green coat, you're sick. Let's not meet again. Nowhere near as creepy as the other stuff that I have read on here, but still very strange, and I have no idea. Me and my mate D, both 17, are both cruising around our local area in his new car. Important to note that D had not passed his test nor had insurance, therefore we usually drove at around 2 to 3 in the morning. We pull up to our local petrol station to get some fags. I had a goatee and I didn't get ID'd, so we came here often. As we pull in, this pretty built dude asks us to roll down our window. We roll down and get chatting to him, and then he tells us that his wife is very angry at him because he's been on a bender and can't get home and is desperate for a lift back. Then he offers us 500 euros for a lift to a city that is only 40 to 50 minutes away. I would be lying if I didn't say that our dumb 17-year-old brains immediately thought that this was an easy payday. But then, the reality set in that we are driving illegally. But we didn't want to tell him that obviously, so we politely declined. But he then gets really insistent that we have to give him a lift, like really insistent. I finally realize that surely he can just get a taxi. The guy working in the garage would definitely call him one, and it's not like he's short on cash, nor would the taxi even break 100 euros. So I say this to him, and he genuinely has no answer to it, and just insists that we should give him a lift. The actual conversation actually went on for almost 20 minutes, but unfortunately, I can't remember the other details. I offer to book him a cash taxi, and after many attempts of convincing him on how much cheaper it is, he then accepts. We say that we are leaving now as we were both weirded out, and he just turns to us and says, "You guys are fucking idiots." But we just kinda smile and then start driving. Out of nowhere, a guy, even bigger built, runs at our car and just throws his drink all over on D through the open window. Obviously, D is fuming and jumps out of the car and I follow. We walk up to the guy, and the guy that was talking to us is profusely apologizing for his mate's actions. I remind D that we are driving illegally, and the last thing that we want to do is to get into a fight and the police be called. So, we get back in, drive off and cancel his taxi. The rest of the night, we were just trying to make sense of what just happened. It just never sat right with me. I don't know why he was so insistent. Maybe so that when we got there, he could just jump out and run, so he gets a free lift for him and his mate. Also, it could have been to rob the car. But then, knocking out 2 fully grown lads for a beat-up dinger just seems a lot of effort. I've always been genuinely curious as to what would have happened if we accepted, and how bad of a situation it could have been. Life hasn't been easy for me lately. With bills piling up and my day job barely covering the essentials, I had to find a way to make ends meet. So, When I saw the help wanted sign at the local gas station, I figured that it was a godsend. The position was for the overnight shift, and while it wasn't ideal, beggars can't be choosers, right? The extra income was crucial, so I took the job without a hesitation. The gas station is a small, unassuming place located on the outskirts of town. It's the kind of place where you wouldn't expect much to happen, especially during the quiet hours of the night. My duties were straightforward: keep an eye on the pumps, restock the shelves, clean the store, and then handle the register. It was monotonous work, but it allowed me to catch up on my thoughts and sometimes even squeeze in a bit of reading when things were really slow. I'd been working there for a couple of months now, and everything seemed pretty standard. Most nights were uneventful, if not downright boring. Occasionally, I would have to deal with an odd grumpy drunk customer or a tweaker looking to buy snacks, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The isolation was something that I even started to appreciate, a peaceful break from the chaos of my daytime life. But then, there was one night that shattered the routine and left me unnerved in a way that I never thought possible. It was an unusual quiet night, even for the gas station. I had just finished restocking the chips, and I was about to settle behind the counter when I saw a large car pull into the lot. It was a bigger model, the kind that stands out in a town like ours, where most people drive older, more practical vehicles. 5 men got out of the car. Each of them looked like they were in their 30s, wearing different styled clothes, but all in the same color, black. On the upper left corner of their outfits, there was a small symbol, something that looked like a triangle with an eye in the center, which was also encased in a circle. I'm sorry, I don't quite remember, but it had an eerie cult-like vibe to it, and it made me feel uneasy right from the start. But oh well, I didn't mind it as much. Probably just a fashion statement, I thought to myself. They walked into the store and began picking out snacks, chatting among themselves. I tried to focus on my task, but I couldn't help but glance at them periodically. There was something about their presence that felt intrusive. They also kept glancing back at me. As they finished gathering their items, they all approached the counter at once. The way they huddled together was so intimidating, overwhelming even. At first, they seemed friendly enough, making small talk as I scanned their snacks. But even after I completed the transaction, they lingered. Their questions began to feel invasive and overwhelming. They asked about my background, my interest, my schedule. The questions kept coming, and I found it hard to escape the barrage. Despite my discomfort, I remained polite, giving shorter and sometimes single-word answers, hoping that they would take the hint and leave me alone. The men then took turns talking about how good their lives had become ever since they joined what they referred to as a support group. Yeah, that's what they called it. They spoke reverently about their leader who had apparently taught them so much and then transformed their lives. They described how they all lived together, ate together, and worshiped together. And in my brain, I was like, worship? It was starting to creep me out. The more they talked, the more it sounded like they were describing a cult, but a modern one at that. My anxiety grew as they started pushing me to join their group, to check it out, insisting on the benefits and how it could change my life too. I declined, saying that I wasn't interested at all, but they kept pushing, their tone becoming more insistent. One of the men seemed to get angry at my refusal. His fake friendly facade was cracking, and he was about to reveal his true self. And I literally felt that I was in danger at that moment. And just when I thought that I might cave in under the pressure, I hear two trucks pull into the lot. I recognize them as regulars who often came in at this hour. The sight of the familiar faces seemed to disrupt whatever sinister intentions the men had. They stopped their aggressive pitch and reluctantly made their way out of the store. But before they all left, one of them looked back at me and said, "We will be seeing you around," in a tone that sent a chill down my spine. As they drove off, I felt a wave of relief but also an undertone of lingering dread. The rest of the night passed uneventfully though, but I couldn't shake off what had happened. My mind raced with questions. What did those men want from me? Were they really trying to recruit me in some kind of cult? And if so, why me? The thought of seeing them again filled me with a sense of deep unease. Since that night, I've been on high alert during my shifts. Every time a car pulls into the lot, my heart skips a beat. I haven't seen those men again though, thankfully. But it still made me wary of strangers and taught me to be more cautious, even in a place that I once considered safe. I don't know what those men were truly after, and I pray that I never find out. To those modern cult men, I hope we never meet again. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. I would also like to give some extra love to my Patreon members, my channel members, and also my tippers. Thank you so much. If you would like to extend a little bit more support for the channel, don't forget to leave a like and a comment down below. If you would like to become a Patreon member, a channel member, a tipper, or even to buy merch, check out the links in the description below. Again, thank you. And I hope you stay scared, because your fear feeds me.